I'm Sarah Veplin. I've been teaching sewing, pattern making, fitting, anything to do with garment construction for about 30 years. Along the way, I wrote a top-selling fitting book in order to help you get your garments to fit better. And today I'm going to be talking with you about choosing a pattern size. And it will be especially pertinent to you if you are a different size on the top than the bottom, for instance, and the figures that the pattern company uses for a size, a particular size, doesn't conform to you because you're bridging a couple of sizes. So let's get into this and figure out how to get a better start for you on a pattern size. I'm using this pattern as an example, not because I think it's a great pattern or a bad pattern. It's just a pattern I happen to have in my collection, and it's a good example. So let's just pretend, let's say that your bust was close to 38 and your waist was close to 34 and your hip was about 46. So when you look at a chart, normally what you do is you choose a size. Here a 14 is a 36 bust, 28 waist, 38 hip. But for most of us, we are not in that proportion. In the example we are imagining, we have a smaller bust than we do have hip. Now, you might be the opposite. You might have a larger bust going to a smaller hip. And so you'd be kind of doing the reverse of what I'm about to explain. So I start by looking at this little chart that almost all patterns give you to get an idea of what size I might be or sizes I might want to be utilizing in a multi-size pattern. So here I'm going from a 16 to a 20 to a 22. 16 at the bust, 20 at the waist, and a 22 at the hip. The numbers of the sizes make absolutely no difference to me. It's just a number. So then what I do is I take a look at the pattern tissue, and most patterns, especially multi-size patterns, have a finished garment measurement. And that's what this is. It always has this symbol of a cross inside of a circle. And that represents that if you sew this garment with a specified seam allowance, which on this pattern is 5/8, when you finish making the top, the size 14 is going to be 40 3/4 inches at the bust. The 16 is going to be 42 3/4, and the 18 is going to be 34 3/4. Now on this pattern, they also have a similar measurement here for the waist, and they do not give a hip measurement, but what I've done is gone from center front, this is our center front line, and measured over to the biggest size, because in my example we have a bigger hip than we have a bust. So I just thought, well, let's measure and see what the size 18 is so we know how much we need to add. I measured over 5/8 of an inch, and then I could get what that measurement is from center front over to the side seam. And I did the same thing on the back. So we'll come back to the hip and the waist, but for now, let's start at the bust. So in my experience, about 1.5 to 2 inches of ease at the bust. And when I say ease, that means that you want your garment that much bigger than your body measurement. That gives you kind of a relaxed but slim fit. So it's not tight at all, but it's not loose and baggy. To me, it's sort of an everyday fit. It's really comfortable, but you're not swallowed up by your garment, nor is it tight on you. So usually what I'll do is think about what my bust measurement is, and let's just, on our example, we're going to use that you are a 38. Now the pattern chart here is recommending that you start with a size 16, and the smallest size in this pattern range is a 14, 16, 18. But if we take the 38 and we add 1.5 inches, that would be 39.5. If we add 2 inches, that's 40. 2 inches of ease at the bust is a lot of room. And we can see that the size 14 here is 40 3/4 inches. So that tells me right now, if I choose a size 14, that it's going to be somewhat roomy. So I can either use that size as a starting place, or I can decide that I want to go down ever so slightly, not the grading difference that was given on the pattern, but I might say, well, here at the bust, I'm going to come in 1/4 inch on the front, and then I would do the same thing on the back, just to make it a little bit smaller. Now, I know we're not talking about cup size in this video. I'll make a couple of references to it, how large the bust itself is, whether you're an A cup, B cup, C cup, D cup. Most patterns are built for, designed for a B cup. That I usually will take care of in the fitting process, or if I know that I am really large busted, I might start with a smaller size pattern and do a full bust adjustment. But very frequently what I like to do is say, okay, let's at least get enough circumference going around the body at the bust, and then I can start to fit from there. My fitting book tells you exactly how I go about doing that. So we might decide that we're going to take in from our size 14 ever so slightly, leave the 14 dart in, and then we can go down to the waist. So if your waist is 34 inches, you probably want at least an inch, inch and a half, 2 inches of ease around the waist. That's personal preference. So I can tell right now with the 34 that a size 18 is really not even going to be big enough, because that only gives me 34 3/4 inches of wearing ease. So that tells me here at the waist level, I want to actually make this bigger than my 18. And so if I add 1/4 inch to my side seam, that'd be 1/4 inch to the right front, and the right back side seam, 1/2 inch. That's going to result in a total of an inch more, because we're going to have 1/2 inch on the right side of the body and 1/2 inch on the left side of the body. So that's going to get us from another inch, so that's going to get us up to 35 3/4 inches. And if your waist is 34, we're getting pretty close to probably being in a good area. So now let's look at our hip. Our hip is 46. We probably want an inch and a half of ease, so we want to get to about 47 and a half. You might want 48, but we want to be at least in that neighborhood. We want to get to 48 inches. How much more do we need to add? I measured from the seam line of the 18 to center front on the front, and I got 11 1/4 inches. I did the same thing on the back, from the center back fold over to the seam line of the back, and that was also 11 1/4 inches. So then I've multiplied that by 2, because we're going to have, this is only half of the back, then we have the other half of the back. So the total distance across the back is 22 1/2 inches. So here on the front, the half pattern is 11 1/4. Multiply that by 2. So the total circumference from side seam across the front to the side seam is 22 1/2. And then I added, that would represent the front, and then I added the amount on the back. In this case, these are the same. In many patterns, they are not. And that gets us to 45 inches. Here, we already had said, if our hip is 46, we want to get to 47 1/2 to 48. So that means we need about 2 1/2 to 3 inches more in the hip. So we have to do a little math. Math is always a little bit tricky for me. So I know if I add quarter of an inch, we're going to get 1 inch total because we add a quarter-inch to the front, quarter-inch to the back, and then we do it on the two sides. So a half an inch on each side seam would be 1 inch. And we want more like 3 inches. So then that means that I need to add about 3/4 of an inch. That's going to give me an inch and a half. 3/4 and 3/4 is an inch and a half on this side seam, inch and a half on the other side seam of the garment would total our 3 inches. And so then I'm going to put a tick mark there. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the back. Here down at this area, and then we would skip over the dart and then down to right above the notches. Now I understand that for many of us our back and our front measurements are not the same. So for some of us we have a broad back and a smaller front. Sometimes it's the opposite. We have a bigger front and a small back. So I'm not trying to account for that now. I'm just trying to get a reasonable starting place in order to do my first muslin to start the fitting process. So now I'm going to do the same thing at the hip. We needed to add that quarter of an inch to my cut line here, and then we're adding 3/4 of an inch to the cut line down here at the hip. So waist and hip. You can see I just taped in some paper to get enough distance there. Our next step is that we're going to blend this seam so we get a nice smooth seam. You can see that the pattern company's seam is relatively smooth, and we want to get, again, something that's smooth. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just need a starting place. The first thing I have to do is fold out my dart. In this case, I'm going to make somewhat of an arbitrary but an educated decision that I'm going to use the 14 dart. If you had a fuller cup, you might choose to use the 16 dart legs. It really is up to you. There's not a whole lot of difference. I would normally take care of that in my first fitting. So I'm going to draw a line here to highlight my 14. I'm going to draw a line here so I can see where my fold is on the 14 dart. I find it's really helpful to get this in a color so it's easy to see on these multi-size patterns. And now I'm going to fold the dart out and pin it in place, and then I can get a nice blend here. So I've made a nice crisp fold along the lower dart leg, and I work on the corner of the table. The dart points on the corner of the table, and that allows me to bring the lower dart leg up to the upper dart leg because I'm going to press my dart down with gravity, and I've got a nice crisp fold all the way over to the dart point. The table allows the rest of the pattern to hang down, which is why I like to do this on a table corner. So now that the dart has been folded out, I can actually see what my side seam would look like if the garment were sewn. And now I can get a nice smooth line through here. I'm going to do this in regular lead pencil. I've been using red so that you could see it more easily, but I usually draft in a regular color so I can erase. And sometimes these things take me a few tries to get it right. So I'm going to first get an idea of how to blend. And you can see I'm going to use my ruler, my styling design ruler. I often move it like this. And if it's really difficult, which it seems to be, to go from this hip on the cut line to this part of the waist on the cut line, I'll make the waist a little bit bigger. Remember, what we're doing is getting the pattern ready for a first mock-up, and then we can start our fitting in earnest. And then I'll turn. I often flip my rulers around, and it's quite natural to me. So I will end up using my ruler in all of its configurations. So sometimes I feel like I've worked with styling design rulers. I refer to them as fashion rulers for so long that They're kind of an extension of my hand. So what I'm looking at now is I want the ruler contiguous with this line, and then I want to start to get a blend over here. And so I'm going to start to move my ruler up and down and visualize how I can do that. And this is starting to look pretty good to me. I might blend it out a little bit more like this. And sometimes what I'll do is draw a couple of different lines and then choose. So now I have a fairly smooth, gentle transition between this small part of the body and the bigger. I like to make these gentle transitions rather than following each and every one of these tick marks, because if I did that, my pattern might end up looking, I'll do dashed lines here, it might look more like this. And that might be what my pattern ends up looking like, but I generally prefer to have a little bit more room for my starting place and then get my hands on the muslin, on the body, so that I can actually fine tune it. So if you had a bigger tummy especially, you would want this extra space. It just is helpful to me to see it in the fabric on the body as soon as I can. And so then I'll have this transition. This is my new cut line. And then I'll do the same thing on the back. And naturally, what I often do is start at the bottom and get that, and then go to the top and get that, and then go into the middle. You don't have to do it that way, but to me that just seems natural. So this line is going to blend really easily down in here. So I might try something like that. Now I might not come down this far. I'm going to put my ruler in like this. And now I have some contiguous to here and here. And that makes a pretty nice, smooth transition without it being too abrupt. This needs to come down just a little bit longer to get to the hem, so I'll do that and draw over the hem. Generally, I would just keep the same arc going up, front as well. Now, some of you might say, does the back addition and subtraction have to be exactly like what you've done on the front? And the answer is ultimately no. I don't want them too different, but I generally like to have them make sense for the pattern piece more than that they have to be identical. Now I'm going to put the two patterns on top of each other. Sometimes I do this just to gather a little bit more information. And I'm going to line up the original patterns cut lines, and they're pretty darn similar. Now I just said they don't have to be, and I know in the finality of getting a garment to fit, very often they are not exactly the same. But seeing that this original pattern, they did have a very similar shape and transition in curves, I can see right in here that underneath there's the line that I drew, and it's coming out here. So they're following each other generally, but they are not following, they being the back, which is underneath, and the front on top. The lines I've drawn are not following it really precisely. So I have a couple of choices. I could pin these patterns together and then just cut on one or the other, so my two side seams were exactly the same as the original pattern was, or I could cut each of them and then walk it and see. Because the original pattern was the same, I probably would make sure that my pattern was also the same as well. Again, all we're doing is getting a starting point. We aren't thinking about fine-tuning the fit now. We're just trying to get a really educated, good starting point. And so I might pin my pattern pieces together, and here is the line of the front, which tends to be a little bit further out than what's on the back underneath. So I'm going to cut along it, and we'll just see what we get. So I'm going to transition from here out to here. And remember, you don't have to do it this way. You can also do it where you just do each the front and the back. Because all we're doing is getting that starting place. And now our back and our front are the same. I'm going to keep them pinned together and cut across to my hem to this line. So I know they're the same. Then I can cut each of those pattern pieces. So I'm going to unpin the two patterns and go on and cut each of these patterns at the bottom. I try to cut very carefully. All of my work, pattern work, I try to be as precise as I can be. It benefits me in the long run, I feel. And I've chosen to use the biggest line, the longest one. I can always change that length of the garment once I am in my fitting process using a muslin or mock-up. I use those terms interchangeably. They're my two side seams. I know that they are the same. If you want, you can remark these notches so that they're very clear, two notches. Often what I'll do is mark one, then line up. I'm using these lengthen shorten lines in the hem, and then I can draw them here right on top, so I know they're really exact, one on top of the other. And then let's take a look here at our armhole, and I can see that the 14 size, which is probably what I'll use, is lines up here. But let's talk about the sleeve and the armhole. Because the bust is smaller than the waist and the hip, I almost certainly would start with the smaller size armhole and shoulder and neckline. Particularly because for most of us, even large busted people, our shoulders don't get wider and wider and wider as the grading goes up in our typical patterns. So I would usually choose this smaller size because that's what we cut here at the bust. And so I'm going to put these patterns back down on top of each other. I'm going to measure in my 5/8 of an inch seam at the top of the side seam at the armhole. And then I'm going to realign my patterns here at the length and shorten lines, the notches, and here at this intersection of the side seam and the armhole cut line, I'm going to put a pin in and lift it up. And you can see that it's very, very close to the pattern's cut line of the 14 underneath. It's just a smidge shorter. So that tells me when I cut my armhole, I'm going to cut this one as is, and then I will cut that one just a smidge shorter. So I start out with a pattern that is very true, meaning that the side seams are the same length. Now my armholes are cut, and I will cut along the 14 size in the neckline because we've used a 14 in the bust, and here in the back the 14 as well. I hope showing you my process of assessing the pattern, understanding what the figures measurements are, how to look at the pattern and see how much wearing ease I want to incorporate into my garment has helped you. Now I know I haven't talked about a sleeve. There's a separate video on how I assess a sleeve pattern, and that's because I always, with any garment that has a set-in sleeve, I always fit this garment without a sleeve in it until I get a really perfect fit on that garment. Then I pull the sleeve up and I fit the sleeve, and then I assess how that sleeve and armhole go together. So just because I've made a change in my garment armhole does not necessarily mean that I'm going to make a similar change or a commensurate change in my sleeve. I'll be showing you that in a future video too. So thank you for joining me. I hope this helps you get started, especially when you know that your figure is different sizes on the top versus the bottom. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. There will be lots more. And if you have a question about something that you'd like me to do a video on, put a post here in the comment section or send me an email. Thank you so much.